So hi and welcome to this NPTEL course titled The Novel Unchanged. This is the final session where we're looking at the relationship of play and forms of representation in Gabriel Garcia Marquez's novel 100 Years of Solitude. So we already had a session where we looked at the critical theory dimension of play in terms of how playfulness as a deconstructive mechanism may be a very useful function of narration, particularly in relation to retelling of historical reality through fiction. So we'll just continue from that point and see how Marquez's novel really offers a really good example of that entanglement, as it were. So this should be on your screen. So Jose Arellano Buendia outlines the universe and its history from his room on the patio, a room which is in turn a microcosmos of Macondo. So the whole idea of the microcosmos becomes important as a miniaturized version, really, a metonymic construct of reality. And that metonymic function is useful for us to look at, particularly in a sort of very stylized, defamiliarized version of the historical reality. And that becomes the sliced version of Macondo. It is a point of departure for the theoretical outlining of the universe. The expansion is not real. It is playful. Jose Arellano travels with maps. He discovers what is already known in other regions. His playful approach is the only means of contact with the macrocosmos which cannot be approached directly. So the indirect quality is important for us to look at as well. So the indirectness of representation is something that we need to pay attention to. Macondo, in turn, is a framed space which, like the chessboard, constitutes a specific town, but is simultaneously all Spanish-American towns. So there is a sense of one little room and everywhere, this sort of John Donne construct of speciality, which is at play over here. However, the difference lies in Garcia Marquez's tendency to focus more on Macondo itself, in its intrinsic reality, than on its universal reversions and multiplications, right? So the whole idea of the entanglement or the interconnectedness between the intrinsic reality as well as how it corresponds to broader versions on multiplied reality becomes important here as well. Now, what's also important is the multitemporality at play. There are multiple dimensions of time that 100 Years of Solitude is able to create with its magic realism, and that also becomes some kind of rewriting of certain kind of normative chronicling of time, right? A certain kind of normative chronicling of history. It undercuts that chronicling method and offers an alternate version, an alternate form of chronicling of history, which is play between magic and reality. So following the concepts of Manfred Eigen and Rothild Winkler, 100 Years of Solitude would be a conservative form of play, an Euborian vein. Its mythical conception would follow the line of Levi-Strauss, the structuralist Levi-Strauss, the centered myth, as opposed to the concepts of Wittgenstein or Derrida. But, as in Borges, the problem is not so simple. We can, in fact, think of Macondo as a center of the universe and an all-embracing conception of Spanish America. So there's a sense of how Macondo can become an all-embracing version of Spanish America, an expansive version, some kind of meta space, as it were. At the same time, it can be a very local space. So this play between localization and generalization, between different scales of temporality and time, is absolutely crucial for Marquez's fiction, particularly in relation to how we're reading it, using a theory of play. So Raymond Williams has already said about 100 Years of Solitude. It has been often called a total novel, a term popularized by Mario Vargas Llosa. Once one understands and accepts the implications and limits of attempting to discuss such a total novel in an introductory fashion, some commentary is possible. The truth is that Macondo, while it may embody the Spanish-American history, is never set as sole center of the universe. Throughout the text, the existence of an outside world to which Macondo has no access and from which it is excluded is stressed. So there's a sense of exclusion as well. So on the one hand, Macondo is an all-embracing space, a meta space, but at the same time, there is also a sense of inaccessibility since the Macondo becomes some kind of constricted space which is not able to connect to other spaces. Right, so the Buendias conceive of that unknown expanse as a chimerial world. So there's a chimera about Macondo in terms of how it's an illusion, which again makes it a very post-structuralist kind of text, and the fact that it really is a play between historical reality and playful possibilities, imaginative illusions of different kinds. Even further away lies a world where history transpires and important events take place, the world of great and early discoveries. The constant allusions to Rioaca imply the existence of another centered space. So contrary to the myth, which is structured around the center and embraces the totality of the world, there's a pre-Columbian myths. The myth of Garcia Marquez shows its limitations, its insufficiency. So we can see how this now begins to become political and quite racial. So there's a sense of the all-embracing myths of the pre-Columbian quality, and of course we see the mythicality, the mythical landscape in Marquez's fiction as one of incompletion and insufficiency and limitation. So the fault lines of myths are also foregrounded. As the philosophers of Lon, Boas, and other terms, Wittgenstein and Derrida say, a system is nothing more than a subordination of all aspects of the universe to any one such aspect. So as in the case of scientific theories, play thus conceived does not try to get beyond those very rules contained within this playful frame. Moreover, Garcia Marquez leans towards the revolutionary dissipative tendency, since scientific theory and conservative play are inalterable in their intrinsic system. Garcia Marquez's play tends to be related to the context and the circumstances. Now, hopefully this will begin to become clear to most of you why this novel is so important in a study of text and context, because the role of context becomes very important in Marquez's play. It's not just some kind of a solipsistic, self-sufficient strategy of different kinds of semiotic, semantic possibilities, but it also corresponds to the contextual reality. It also corresponds to the geopolitical, geographical, historical realities around the text, right? So how each permutation, combination, how each production of playfulness within the text corresponds to the world outside the text as well. While the protagonist of No One Writes to the Colonel awaits in vain the letter that will never arrive, while rowboats leaving once a week are the only contact with the outside world, airplanes fly overhead, and the doctor reads in all newspapers of the far-off world where things happen, Macondo is being isolated from the universe. With devices different from those of Derrida, Garcia Marquez goes about ironically negating the centered mythical concept. So therein lies the irony at heart. So even the playfulness in Marquez is not devoid of irony. So there is this self-undercutting strategy within the play, which makes Macondo both connected and disconnected with the outside world, which is to say how the representation of Macondo as an old space utopia, or no space, which is also utopia, becomes a function, an interplay of isolation and connection. So in the face of this, Garcia Marquez, like Borges, leaves us back at point zero. Macondo is destroyed by the wind and wrenched from history because races condemned to 100 years of solitude did not have a second opportunity on Earth. Fundamentally a pessimistic statement, right? So there is a sense of Macondo, being wiped away by the forces of nature because it is a cursed race, it's a cursed place, and a sense of erasure becomes important. And what's also important in the context of the story is how forms of encoding, forms of chronicling also contain within those, sometimes covert, sometimes overt forms of violence through which this erasure is enacted. Right. So now we come to the real idea of play in 100 Years of Solitude in terms of how it corresponds to the historical, social, political realities around. So the concept of play as creation of a second reality or alternate reality is obvious in 100 Years of Solitude. It does not constitute a linear, realistic text that empirically repeats the history of Spanish America. So, and this is something I may have mentioned already in the earlier session, that what Marquez offers as an act of fabulation, as an act of narrativization, is an alternate chronicle of history, an alternate chronicle of time, an alternate chronicle of temporal reality, which is not linear in quality, which is not realistic in quality. Hence, the idea of magic realism is not empirical at all. So, within the ensemble of the text, the supra-logical level, outside the logic, the supra-logical level implies in the playful aspect an elaboration and a depuration of history. So it's a very disruptive narrative, an interrupted narrative that is at play over here, which is foregrounded. The interruptions and fault lines are constantly foregrounded by Marquez. The mythical, the playful mythical course, in a sense of Huizinga and Levi-Strauss, is the principal recourse. But a closer look at the text, object of later, more extensive studies, allows us to see that, in this sense, the most significant aspects of Spanish-American history may have been embodied and integrated spatially and temporally in Macondo. So Macondo, despite being this magic realist space, also contains the ingredients which may most authentically articulate Spanish-American history. So it's very authentic articulation, how authenticity becomes, in a very paradoxical way, a function of magicality. How authenticity becomes the function of paradox, of irony in many sense. Right. So the basic recourse is unquestionably playful. The recontextualization of myth, of history, of the chronicles of the Indies, and the linear and the paradigmatic narration of fable. So the many different patterns of storytelling which are at sometimes collaboration, sometimes in contestation with each other. So original biblical sin is recontextualized. So we can see how the word recontextualize is used in a very recursive fashion, because there is this epical, mythical subtext which are brought back, in terms of making them connect to the contemporary reality. And sometimes the connect is quite coercive in quality. It's sort of forced to connect. And therein lies some kind of a narrative violence or epistemic violence at work. So the original biblical sin is recontextualized in the original incest of the Buendias and the eternal curse on their car. So the idea of damnation gets replayed in a different form. The pilgrimage of the chosen people is recontextualized as the search for the land that no one had promised them. So we can see how it's a very metonymic reconstruction of the biblical narrative, right? So by metonymic, I mean incomplete, fractured, and the production of partiality is something which Marquez's fiction does very well, and that therein lies its playful, subversive potential. It's never really a total recreation or a total manifestations, but at the same time, it can be total as well as partial. So we see something like Macondo. It is a meta space of all possibilities. At the same time, it is also a function of connectivity and disconnectivity. So, if the children of the Viracocha found the city of Cuzco, where the divine rod was buried in the ground according to a divine plan, the Buendias settled at the place where they will found Macondo out of sheer tiredness and not having to take the road back to Riohaca, right? It's in unpropitious and completely isolated terrain. So the other thing important for us to understand here is the accidental quality of knowledge, the accidental quality of discoveries, the accidental quality of appropriation that is at play in Marquez's fiction. And when I say accidentality, what I also mean is the liminal ways in which identities are created, ownership is appropriated, sometimes with violence, sometimes with sheer serendipity, serendipitous way, in terms of how just chance and coincidences come together to create this economy of happenstance, as it were, through which play is established and re-established, which is the whole business of recontextualization at work, because there is that mythical, biblical subtext, the classical subtext, which sometimes in a very serendipitous way finds its way into contemporary reality, and that serendipity in terms of how the classic context comes back, whether it's a biblical story or the incest story or the the forbidden son, the forbidden narrative story, that gets played out in very postmodern, post-structuralist way. So the accidentality and the serendipity in Marquez's novel, they are not really just digressions. They are very much part of the narrative function. They're very much part of the core narrative function through which identities are articulated and also misarticulated. The other thing which is important for us to underscore here is how every form of identity formation is an approximation as well as a misidentification. So every identification is also misidentification, and in some sense it connects to another very important theory in post-colonial studies, which is one of mimicry. And if you look at mimicry, for example, the Homi Bhabha definition of mimicry, you find that mimicry can be accidental, mimicry can be intentional, mimicry is always discursive in quality, but there is a sense of misidentification about mimicry as well, which makes it slippery as well as excessive in quality. Right. At the same time, this recontextualizes the arrival and conquest of the Spaniards, their chaotic route, and do also the ascent of Remedios, the beautiful one, the flood recorded both in the Bible and in the pre-Columbian mythologies, the plague this time of insomnia, Melquiades' holy book, and the four Aurelianos, Amaranthus weaving to structure time and wood of death, etc. So all these different subtexts, whether it's the plague or the flood, or the holy book, or the weaving of structure of time to procrastinate death. So all these come together to create different realities and possibilities in Marquez's fiction. Now, what's interesting here is there are these. We keep talking about the playfulness, we keep talking about the ludic landscape, but what it also does at a very empirical level is it compares and contrasts and looks at how different cultural narratives may be calibrated and juxtaposed together. So, for instance, the idea of the flood, which is a very biblical term, a very biblical event, which is also found in pre-Columbian mythology. So there is these kinship structures that Marquez's fiction also flags up, right, in terms of how different cultural contexts, different cultural formations can also establish, cognitive, semantic, narrative kinship strategies. So, finally, the narrative tone of fable is also a narrative discourse of the chronicles of the Indies. So it offers an alternate chronicling of time, of the history at work, and even more so of the Bible and of indigenous cosmogonies, right? So the whole idea of indigenous, identity, as it sort of exists in collaboration and sometimes in contestation with the biblical story, is flagged up. Most of this is very well analyzed in Wayne Fields' article, 100 Years of Solitude and a New World Storytelling. So this is another article which I often teach, not directly relevant to this course, but still worth reading if you wanted to find out how Marquez here offers a new world storytelling in terms of how the terra incognita in Marquez's text also produces unique stories which sometimes undercut the empirical stories from different kinds of historical archives. So there's a sense of archive fever, if you use a Derridan term, which is at work in Marquez's fiction. So there's a feverish quality of narration, a feverish quality of chronicling of what had happened in history, and that feverish quality is flagged up through magic realism in Marquez. So upon decontextualizing all these elements, Garcia Marquez transgresses them in the original textuality. So along with decontextualization, the next natural step is transgressions. How do you transgress boundaries? How do you transgress realities to produce alternate versions of reality, alternate versions of representations? And inverting their meaning, recontextualizing them in a totality where the textual weave is so subtle and organic that it is impossible to separate. Now, again, just as a way of digression, if you look at the word text, and if you look at the word textile, we find that they come from very similar etymological sources. So it's not really an accident that the word weave over here is both a metaphor as well as quite literary in its own way, because just like textile is woven together, a text can also be woven together. Again, sometimes accidentally, sometimes to serendipity, but whether it's accident or deliberate or serendipitous, there is an element of weaving in of a text which can accommodate ambivalence, which can accommodate happenstance, and so on and so forth, and ultimately becomes impossible to segregate. The Spanish-American world is playful in and of itself. Its culture is a recontextualization of the most diverse elements. Now, this allows us to come to a term that I wanted to spend a little bit of time with, which is a term, two terms really, both used extensively by the philosopher Mikhail Bakhtin. One is heteroglossia, the other is polyphony, right? So heteroglossia, as you can imagine, is many meanings, many indexes of meanings, hetero as in diverse, as a diverse ecology of meanings. And polyphony is many voices, many tones, many modes of tonality, really. And how this polyphonic heteroglossic construct is something which allows this recontextualization to take place. How diversity can find a very interesting representation. It is weaving in, almost like a textile, as well as a text in Marquez's fiction. Right. So we now move on to some of the other aspects of Marquez's story, which are of use for us, particularly in relation to the narrative strategy and producing heteroglossia. So the narrator, this is the final paragraph on this page. The narrator in 100 Years of Solitude is all-embracing, atemporal, even though the narration may be recorded in the in a preterite or biblical and or chronistic time. So there is a sense of all-inclusivity about the narration, all-embracing, all-inclusive, very plastic and accommodative, even though it is a chronicling of a certain kind of history. So again, we have display between the meta quality of the narrative looking outward, as well as the micro quality of the narrative looking inward, and that both are play with each other. This preterite does not exist as such, and there is much irony in its use. So there is a fundamental ironical tone in Marquez's fiction, which sometimes undercuts its own claims of chronicling. So everything has already occurred at the beginning of the novel. So it is basically an in media res or some kind of a post hoc representation. Everything, all the events are finished, all the events are exhausted. The time of the narration is an eternal present, where linear chronological meaning is lost. This recourse of a present which constantly re-engenders itself, so reproduces, remanufactures itself, is none other than a recontextualization of the mythical concept of the pre-Columbians, particularly of the Maya Quiche, for whom time is not an abstract becoming, but rather a vital organic force. So there are references to Mayan civilization, a Mayan sense of temporality, which obviously has a more visceral, vital understanding of time, not something of an abstract mathematical phenomenon outside the body, but time as some kind of an embodied experience. It's corporeal, visceral experience. And this viscerality of thick time, if you can use a phrase like this, is very palpably present in Marquez's fiction, the idea of time accumulating in the body and expanding the body, this corporealization of time, and so on and so forth. The present is a continuing to be. The present is a work in progress, as a function of performance, a function of formation, a constant affirming of its own existence. Past, present, and future do not exist according to our contemporary understanding of the terms. If we examine Popol Vuh, we see that same anachronisms as in 100 Years of Solitude and the same reiterated style. So the whole idea of different recursive structures finds a place in Marquez's fiction. And of course, What that means is it undercuts the empirical, normative chronicling of time, a normative sequence of time. So it just becomes some very heteroglossic and very carnivalesque quality through which time becomes an embodied phenomenon, time becomes a corporeal phenomenon, time becomes a visceral phenomenon. So what we're trying to achieve here is a study of the viscerality of time, the thickening of time. Now, when I say viscerality and thickening, we also need to locate it in the sense of the speed of time. So you find in Marquez's fiction, sometimes time slows down. So what I meant by thickening of time. And sometimes there are these leaps of time which can offer a very kinetic quality in terms of its movement, accidental, serendipitous, and so on and so forth. So we see how this quotation over here, the last of the Aurelianos, discovers that Melquiades has not put events in the order of man's conventional time, but has concentrated a century of daily episodes in such a way that it coexisted in one instant. So we see how there's some kind of a supra-mathematical dimension of time that Mark is offering over here, which is not really that of normative logic, or sequential logic, but rather where a century of episodic experiences can be made to exist or represented as one instant. So there's absolute condensation of time, time compressed into one moment, this compression of time in one chronotop of one sort of laminated sense of temporality is also produced in Marquez's fiction. So the whole novel, after all, is Melquiades' writings, and it brings us to an eminently playful text with various levels of complexity. We have a narrator who is displaced on many levels, from narrative chronistic to intimate and poetic, encompassing and aggregating several temporal levels, and ironically making us believe what he narrates, but confronting us thus with the process of meta-communication, which will take us further beyond the surface of the text. So there is a sense of willing suspension of disbelief, to use Coleridge's term, but at the same time, that suspension takes us further into semantic extensions, into new interpretative possibilities, into new textual possibilities. We stand before a text which questions itself implicitly. So I mentioned this already, how Marquez creates this narrative ecology where the text undercuts itself in very interesting ways, in the same way as how the actor writing history in a very meta-historical way undercuts the process of history writing itself. Right. So this brings us to the levels of reflection that are not recordable in a traditional narration. So we talked about this earlier, I suppose, at some point, how to say the unsayable, how to articulate the inarticulatable, right? So that's something which cannot be articulated. How do you put that into a representational matrix? How do you encode the experience which is beyond language, right? Or beyond the normative matrix of representation. So we discover at the end that the text negates itself and erects itself as reality of the world invented by the word, and that it only exists as a magical word, all of which is a recontextualization of the meaning of primitive language. To name things is to make them present, right? So the whole idea of naming something, the whole idea of giving a word to something, which is some kind of a quasi-godlike quality or quasi-divine quality, is attributed to the narrative. So narrative here carries the agency, almost divine agency, magical agency, to confer existence, to confer ontological possibility through naming. So I give something a name and that thing happens or becomes as a material reality, right? So that politics of naming, the politics of inscription, iteration, and materialization takes place in Marquez's novel. So in Garcia Marquez's case, the text defines itself, the final sentence here, the text defines itself as made up, as so many dried leaves, which will be blown away by the apocalyptic wind. Who are the inventors of Lon Boris's narrator wonders ironically. So the whole idea of something which is ultimately perishable, something which will be blown away by the apocalyptic wind becomes important. The ultimate apocalypse, the sort of teleological sense of reality, but also a sense of cyclicity. So every act of destruction can also be an act of anticipation and resurrection. That's something which, and in that sense, it connects to oral narratives, it connects to folk psychology, it connects to collective memory, in the sense that that which is imperishable, the memory which is always cyclical, which is always find its way back, despite the damage, despite the destruction that takes place. Right, now we wind up now in the last bit of the essay, where we look at how, the idea of the space, the place, all become very important, especially in relation to Marquez's fiction, but also in relation to how a particular kind of narration they correspond to a certain kind of historical reality. Because if you look at a course like this, which is about novel and change, we see how the novel as a fictional construct, how the novel as a narrative function is a producer of realities, a producer of, change in a sense that is represented. But at the same time, how do you choose to represent change? That becomes a moral, ethical, artistic, and also political question, right? So the politics of representation becomes important. It also allows us to get insights into certain kinds of changes, certain forms of changes, which may not be chronicled in a normative framework, which is what the essay ends with. So play, in its broader sense, has emerged as a vital need for several of the most important contemporary Latin American writers. Of course, we mentioned Borges, we mentioned Marquez, we mentioned other writers as well. Since Luis Borges in narrative and Huidobro in poetry, after Borges's Ficciones and Cortázar's hopscotch, Garcia Marquez's narrator marks a fundamental change in the process of writing and reading. By now, it is clear that Garcia Marquez's texts, in particular 100 Years of Solitude, follow the ludic trajectory that began in Borges. So we see how Borges is seen as some kind of an anticipator of what happens in Marquez subsequently. Both authors continue along the lines of framed play. So framed play, we discussed already that within a particular frame, within a particular finite frame, there are these infinite possibilities of play at work. So the chess game metaphor which was used. So there are these finite number of chess pieces, finite number of chess birds. And within that finite number, we have this infinite play of possibilities. So the line of framed play still corresponding to Huizinga's concepts, but falling even closer to the concepts of Lévi-Strauss and Mircea Eliade's centered myths. So we can see how different forms of philosophy, anthropology, structuralism may be woven in a study of Marquez's text, which is why I think we have chosen to read these two essays, particularly Lowland and this essay, because it allows us to really connect and plug into and draw on a very rich and dense and complex critical theory vocabulary, also vocabulary from philosophy and structuralism. So nevertheless, as I mentioned earlier, they're still not completely faithful to this conservative view of play. The irony generated by both Borges and Garcia Marquez tends to paradoxically negate this conservative perspective, taking the process of writing to a zero base. So there's a sense of a conservative playfulness at work, but at the same time, there is the ancient attribute of irony, which can always undercut what the narrative sets out to do. So the whole idea of the self-undercutting narrative becomes important here as well. So the text comments on itself, transgresses itself, and ends up negating its own reality. So it becomes some kind of a self-consuming text, a self-destructive text, a text which both writes itself as well as erases itself. So this act of articulation, the act of inscription, also becomes an act of erasure. So the simultaneity of inscription and erasure is at play. And what that means at a representational level, especially apropos of history, material reality, is our history writing too is a function of encoding and erasure, is a function of remembering and forgetting, something that we've discussed already in other texts. So even more so, Borges and Garcia Marquez transgress the traditional concepts of play and playfulness themselves. So both writers do it in very, very complex ways. Right. So just to wind up, So we can see how the evolution, the final bit which shall be on the screen, the evolution and diverse directions of playful writing throughout the most contemporary writers are subjects for another investigation that is already undertaken. In this study, however, it was necessary to prove, that is the corroboration that comes in the end, to prove that 100 Years of Solitude is essentially a playful text in order to give us an opportunity to reread and focus our perspective from new points of view. So, like all great texts, like all great works of literature, what we see in 100 Years of Solitude is a production of multiple possibilities, a production of multiple interpretations, which is why you find this novel really gets anthologized in so many volumes even today in 2024. So we can see how this becomes some kind of a very fitting finale, really, to a course like this, in terms of winding up some of the things we've discussed, starting from Robinson Crusoe right down to Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Because if Crusoe, the Daniel Defoe novel, that can be seen as the formation of the classic realist text in terms of how the novel begins to encode territoriality, encode an expansionist view of the world. When we come towards the end to Marquez, we find how the fault lines are actually foregrounded, how the limitations of the text are also foregrounded, how the text can be both an act of articulation and an act of ironical self-destruction, right? So the idea of representation also becomes connected to the idea of, erasure, and that's something which Marquez flags up very, very overtly and covertly. So with that, we end our reading of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's fiction, but also overall the end of the course. I hope there are some tangible and important and substantial takeaways that you've got already in terms of looking at how the novel as a medium, how the novel as a genre is uniquely able really to reflect different forms of social changes, sometimes through forms of representation, forms of defamiliarization, forms of deterritorialization, and how all these different narrative functions and strategies correspond to changes in socio-historical, cultural, political reality, sometimes abruptly, sometimes slowly, sometimes through big events, sometimes through very quotidian processes, right? And so the novel can be both quotidian in terms of the dailiness of the novel, the slowness of the novel, but also being subversive, abrupt, and sudden in their production and of different forms of possibilities, right? So just to reiterate and end on a note of summing up, really, the novel continues to become, continues to stay, continues to be very relevant even today in 2024 as the very interesting encoding of experience, a very interesting chronicle of experience, both as a form of a collective memory in terms of history, in terms of ethnographic details, but also as a very good example of subjective experience. So this sort of intersectional quality of the novel in terms of how it is both able to encapsulate and encode a diachronic understanding of history, a collective understanding of history and memory and experience, at the same time also offering us experiences of inwardness, experiences of reflection, experiences of very, very subjective phenomenological frames, psychological states, and so on and so forth. So we see a novel like Nervous Conditions by Dangarembga, or Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, or really any of the novels you studied in this course, we find that intersection between the longitudinal method and the latitudinal method, the horizontal method and the vertical method of representation, where the collective, the shared, the symbolic can constantly engage with the interior, the deep, and the subjective, right? So both the subjective and the collective, both the objective, empirical, and the phenomenological and fluid are constantly at play with each other, which is why we wanted to end the course on the note to play, on a tribute to play, if you will, because Marquez, of course, becomes one of the most celebrated writers of this playful tradition of representation, because at the end of the day, the novel is a play of possibilities, a play of historical realities, a play which is a function of encoding as well as erasure, a function of inscription as well as ironization. So that play becomes absolutely fundamental to our study of the novel, our examination of the novel as a literary form, as a literary medium. So with that, we end our reading of Marquez. We also end formally our reading of the different novels in this course. I hope it was a useful course for you. I hope you got some interesting insights into the really interesting texts that we managed to cover in this course, starting with Robinson Crusoe through Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, then of course Charles Dickens's Great Expectations, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, and right down to Danganronpa through Arkan Narayan's Guide, and then of course Lowland by Jhumpa Lahiri, and Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, and finishing as we did with Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, which becomes in a very symbolic way an ultimate testimony to the novel's possibilities of playfulness, or the novel's possibilities, the novel's unique ability to create productive possibilities, imaginative possibilities through playfulness, through an interplay, as it were, between historical reality and imaginative possibilities, which makes the novel as a medium both a chronicler of realities as well as something which can be potentially subversive in terms of defamiliarizing and deterritorializing historical reality. In other words, just to conclude, the novel is and remains to this day a very interesting entanglement of historical reality and imaginative possibilities. It can bring in different focal points of view, different focal positions, which can mix up what really happened with what could have happened, what did not happen, and sometimes it can mix it up even further by also articulating what should have happened, the moral position, the ethical position, right? So it becomes a very complex instrument to accommodate ambivalence. Equally, it becomes a very complex instrument to accommodate absence, silences, elisions. All these things become very important in novels as well, which is why we decided to end the course with the note and a tribute to the innate playful quality, the ludic quality that a novel has by form, by design, by scope, by its different representational, through its different representational strategies. So thank you very much for attending this course. I hope it was useful for you, and I look forward to interacting with you in other sessions at other places, and hopefully with other courses in the times to come. Thank you very much again for your attention.